edge of the Arizona desert where wind scrapes across red earth like a whisper from something ancient, a small wooden chapel once stood, a structure so plain it might have been mistaken for a barn. Its walls were built from sun-bleached planks, its roof slanted and sagging, its bell long since fallen silent. Yet in the winter of 1904, that forgotten building became the heart of one of the strangest and most unsettling tragedies in American frontier history. When lawmen arrived at dawn, they found the windows blackened, the doors fused to their frames, and the scent of burned flesh hanging heavy in the cold air. Inside, 23 people sat in silence, charred but still upright, as if mid-prayer. No one could explain how it had begun. Neighbors had reported a faint glow on the horizon the night before, like a campfire too large for the desert. Some said they heard singing, low, rhythmic, and desperate. Others swore they saw figures walking into the flames without a sound. But by the time anyone gathered the courage to approach, the fire had already devoured the chapel, leaving only a circle of ash and the faint outline of a cross scorched into the sand. What remained was not just the aftermath of fire, but a question that still echoes through the canyons. Why did they do it? The group called themselves the Brethren of the Purified Dawn. Little is known about them, no records of birth, no land ownership, not even a list of names. They appeared in the small mining town of St. David a few years before the fire, moving into an abandoned homestead on the outskirts. Locals said they were quiet, polite, even God-fearing. They traded goods at the general store, spoke little of themselves, and always left before sundown. But over time, something shifted. The townsfolk began noticing signs of strange ritual, bonfires burning for no reason, livestock left untouched but surrounded by chalk symbols, and a soft, collective chanting that drifted across the desert on windless nights. The man they called their guide was described as tall, gaunt, and calm, a presence that carried both comfort and unease. He was never seen in daylight, and when he spoke, his voice trembled as if straining against something too large for human breath. He taught that the world had become poisoned, that human flesh was a prison, and that fire alone could release the spirit from its decaying shell. He said the end would not come from the heavens, but from within. For those who believed him, this was not a death cult, it was salvation. People in town dismissed it at first. Arizona, after all, was filled with wanderers, preachers, and dreamers promising new beginnings under the relentless sun. But something about this group was different. They refused medical help, stopped attending church, and turned away all visitors. Children were pulled from school, crops left to rot, and the windows of their home were covered in black cloth. Then came the letters, cryptic, handwritten notes left on doorsteps, each signed with a smudge of ash. "The dawn must be purified," they read. "Do not fear the fire, fear the flesh." When a traveling doctor stopped by in late November, he found the property deserted except for the chapel. Inside, the floor was covered in sawdust and oil. A single book sat open on the pulpit, a Bible, its pages hollowed out to hide a small vial of dark resin. The doctor left disturbed, convinced they were planning something terrible. Days later, he returned with the sheriff, but the chapel was gone, replaced by a pit of smoldering embers. What struck investigators most was the quietness of the scene. There were no signs of struggle, no screams heard by neighbors, no evidence of restraint. The bodies sat in perfect formation, men, women, and children, all facing east toward the rising sun. Some still held hands. Some appeared to be smiling, and yet their eyes, those that remained, seemed wide open, as if caught between terror and revelation. The coroner's report listed the cause of death simply as self-immolation, but the details defied understanding. The burns were uneven, some shallow, some deep enough to expose bone, as though the fire had chosen its path deliberately. Certain objects within the chapel, wooden chairs, hymnals, a small piano, remained untouched. The sheriff described it as a fire that burned with intention. Rumors spread faster than the investigation could keep up. Some claimed the cult had discovered a flammable oil derived from desert sage, capable of burning cold and slow. Others whispered that the fire was never physical at all, but spiritual, that they had burned from within. Newspapers across the country published conflicting accounts. "Arizona fanatics destroy themselves," read one. "Holy fire cleanses believers," read another. But beyond the headlines, one truth remained: no one ever found the guide's body. In the weeks that followed, survivors from nearby towns reported seeing a lone figure walking the desert roads at dusk. Some said he was barefoot, his clothes scorched to ash, his face hidden beneath a hood. He carried no lantern, no supplies, yet travelers swore they could see a faint light following him, an orange shimmer that flickered across the sand like a dying flame. What happened in that chapel has never been fully explained. Historians called it mass hysteria, psychologists a manifestation of isolation and faith pushed to its limits. But in Arizona, where the wind still howls through the ruins of mining towns and old churches, people tell it differently. They say that if you drive past the desert at night, when the air is dry and the stars sharp as glass, you might see a glow on the horizon, a pale circle of light that flickers once, then disappears. They call it the purified dawn. And though more than a century has passed, the question lingers, unburned by time. Did they die in madness, or did they find something we were never meant to see? At the edge of the Arizona desert, where wind scrapes across red earth like a whisper from something ancient, a small wooden chapel once stood, a structure so plain it might have been mistaken for a barn. Its walls were built from sun-bleached planks, its roof slanted and sagging, its bell long since fallen silent. Yet in the winter of 1904, that forgotten building became the heart of one of the strangest and most unsettling tragedies in American frontier history. When lawmen arrived at dawn, they found the windows blackened, the doors fused to their frames, and the scent of burned flesh hanging heavy in the cold air. Inside, 23 people sat in silence, charred but still upright, as if mid-prayer. No one could explain how it had begun. Neighbors had reported a faint glow on the horizon the night before, like a campfire too large for the desert. Some said they heard singing, low, rhythmic, and desperate. Others swore they saw figures walking into the flames without a sound. But by the time anyone gathered the courage to approach, the fire had already devoured the chapel, leaving only a circle of ash and the faint outline of a cross scorched into the sand. What remained was not just the aftermath of fire, but a question that still echoes through the canyons. Why did they do it? The group called themselves the Brethren of the Purified Dawn. Little is known about them, no records of birth, no land ownership, not even a list of names. They appeared in the small mining town of St. David a few years before the fire, moving into an abandoned homestead on the outskirts. Locals said they were quiet, polite, even God-fearing. They traded goods at the general store, spoke little of themselves, and always left before sundown. But over time, something shifted. The townsfolk began noticing signs of strange ritual, bonfires burning for no reason, livestock left untouched but surrounded by chalk symbols, and a soft, collective chanting that drifted across the desert on windless nights. The man they called their guide was described as tall, gaunt, and calm, a presence that carried both comfort and unease. He was never seen in daylight, and when he spoke, his voice trembled as if straining against something too large for human breath. He taught that the world had become poisoned, that human flesh was a prison, and that fire alone could release the spirit from its decaying shell. He said the end would not come from the heavens, but from within. For those who believed him, this was not a death cult, it was salvation. People in town dismissed it at first. Arizona, after all, was filled with wanderers, preachers, and dreamers promising new beginnings under the relentless sun. But something about this group was different. They refused medical help, stopped attending church, and turned away all visitors. Children were pulled from school, crops left to rot, and the windows of their home were covered in black cloth. Then came the letters, cryptic, handwritten notes left on doorsteps, each signed with a smudge of ash. "The dawn must be purified," they read. "Do not fear the fire, fear the flesh." When a traveling doctor stopped by in late November, he found the property deserted except for the chapel. Inside, the floor was covered in sawdust and oil. A single book sat open on the pulpit, a Bible, its pages hollowed out to hide a small vial of dark resin. The doctor left disturbed, convinced they were planning something terrible. Days later, he returned with the sheriff, but the chapel was gone, replaced by a pit of smoldering embers. What struck investigators most was the quietness of the scene. There were no signs of struggle, no screams heard by neighbors, no evidence of restraint. The bodies sat in perfect formation, men, women, and children, all facing east toward the rising sun. Some still held hands. Some appeared to be smiling, and yet their eyes, those that remained, seemed wide open, as if caught between terror and revelation. The coroner's report listed the cause of death simply as self-immolation, but the details defied understanding. The burns were uneven, some shallow, some deep enough to expose bone, as though the fire had chosen its path deliberately. Certain objects within the chapel, wooden chairs, hymnals, a small piano, remained untouched. The sheriff described it as a fire that burned with intention. Rumors spread faster than the investigation could keep up. Some claimed the cult had discovered a flammable oil derived from desert sage, capable of burning cold and slow. Others whispered that the fire was never physical at all, but spiritual, that they had burned from within. Newspapers across the country published conflicting accounts. Arizona fanatics destroy themselves, read one. Holy fire cleanses believers, read another. But beyond the headlines, one truth remained: no one ever found the guide's body. In the weeks that followed, survivors from nearby towns reported seeing a lone figure walking the desert roads at dusk. Some said he was barefoot, his clothes scorched to ash, his face hidden beneath a hood. He carried no lantern, no supplies, yet travelers swore they could see a faint light following him, an orange shimmer that flickered across the sand like a dying flame. What happened in that chapel has never been fully explained. Historians called it mass hysteria, psychologists a manifestation of isolation and faith pushed to its limits. But in Arizona, where the wind still howls through the ruins of mining towns and old churches, people tell it differently. They say that if you drive past the desert at night, when the air is dry and the stars sharp as glass, you might see a glow on the horizon, a pale circle of light that flickers once, then disappears. They call it the purified dawn. And though more than a century has passed, the question lingers, unburned by time. Did they die in madness, or did they find something we were never meant to see? It began quietly, as all tragedies do in places where silence is common. There were no outbursts, no panic, no shouting in the days before the fire. The people who lived near the Brethren's homestead would later recall that the family stopped visiting town altogether. Their carts no longer rolled into the trading post. No one came to fetch water from the well. At night, the desert remained strangely lit, a faint orange shimmer that pulsed just above the horizon, like heat rising from the sand even in the cold of December. The first to notice something wrong was a woman named Abigail Ruth, who lived half a mile away. She told the sheriff later that she had heard singing drifting through the night, low and measured, not like hymns but like murmured breathing, many voices blending into one. She said the sound continued long after midnight, when the coyotes stopped calling and the wind went still. The next morning, she found ashes in her chicken coop, fine gray dust scattered by unseen hands. Inside the Brethren's compound, things had been changing for weeks. The guide had instructed them to fast, to abandon their possessions, and to prepare for what he called the rising of the pure flame. Diaries recovered later from a nearby shack described days of stillness. Families gathered in silence, heads bowed, hands clasped. They were told to let their bodies weaken, to empty the vessel so that the spirit could rise unburdened. Hunger became devotion. Sleep was forbidden. They sat for hours in the chapel, eyes fixed on the altar, waiting for the guide to speak. When he finally did, it was to announce the date. December 12, 1904. The flesh will be undone, he told them. The light will come through the wound. From that moment, they worked in complete secrecy. They gathered oil from lanterns, collected dry mesquite branches, and stripped the chapel floor of paint so the wood could breathe. Children were made to carry pails of sand from the riverbed, pouring it around the building in a wide circle to keep the fire from escaping, as one note described. No one questioned the instructions. The guide spoke softly, almost tenderly, and the tone of his voice carried more authority than any sermon. On the evening before the fire, a storm had passed over the desert, no rain, only wind and lightning that never touched the ground. Witnesses remembered seeing strange reflections in the clouds, flashes of orange far too steady to be thunder. In town, a few people joked that the fire worshippers must be holding another of their ceremonies, but in truth, none dared go near them. Inside the chapel, the brethren gathered for the last time. The guide stood at the front, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes closed. Around him, candles burned low in shallow bowls, their wax dripping into sand. The air was thick with the scent of sage, kerosene, and sweat. The children sat in the first row, the women behind them, and the men at the back. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the crackle of oil lamps filled the stillness. He began to speak, not loudly, not with fire or fury, but with the calmness of a man describing something inevitable. He told them the flesh was tired. He told them they had lived long enough among shadows. He said the dawn would not come from the sky, but from within their bones. His words were transcribed later from fragments of burnt paper. We do not end. We begin again in light. The flame is the bridge. One by one, they approached the altar, placing small tokens at its base. Rings, rosaries, bits of hair tied with string. The guide dipped each in oil and set them aflame, murmuring a prayer that no one outside their circle would ever decipher. When the last token had burned to ash, he raised his hand and gave a final instruction. When the bell rings, do not look back. The bell never rang. It had melted years earlier in a lightning strike, but in the stillness of that moment they imagined it. According to the sheriff's report, the fire began shortly after midnight. Locals described a glow that rose without smoke, a light so clean it made the stars seem dim. The wind did not carry the smell of burning wood, only something faintly sweet, like resin or sap. The flame spread upward, not outward, and the chapel did not collapse. It seemed to fade. When investigators sifted through the remains days later, they found traces of an unusual oil soaked into the wood, a mixture of sage extract and animal fat. Its properties were unlike any common fuel. It burned cool and slow, producing little soot. Experts speculated that the brethren may have believed it to be sacred. They found small bowls arranged around the perimeter, each containing charred wicks, as if the fire had been invited, not resisted. Most unsettling were the bodies. They were seated in perfect symmetry, hands resting on their knees, faces turned east. Their clothing was scorched, but their posture unbroken. Some still clutched one another's fingers, their skin fused by heat. Others sat alone, eyes hollow, lips parted. The guide's chair stood empty at the front, untouched by flame. No remains were ever found that could be identified as his. A nearby homestead kept a journal describing what the sky looked like that night. There was light where there should be darkness, the man wrote. No smoke, no smell, only a glow and a sound like air being pulled through glass. He did not know what he was seeing. By dawn, the light was gone. In the following days, townspeople approached the site with a mixture of fear and fascination. The air was still warm, though the fire had burned itself out. Nothing grew on the ground for months afterward, not even the hardy desert grass. A faint pattern was visible in the ash, a spiral etched into the earth, as if something had turned slowly before vanishing. Inside what remained of the chapel's foundation, investigators found objects that defied easy explanation. Glass jars filled with sand, bits of copper wire wound into circles, a small mirror blackened from heat, and a series of sketches showing human figures surrounded by flame. At the center of each drawing was a single word written in the same careful hand: ascend. The coroner's notes described the condition of the remains as inconsistent with an ordinary fire. Certain limbs were preserved while others had been reduced to powder. Some skulls showed no charring at all, while bones nearby had been fused into glass-like fragments. The report concluded with a line that still puzzles researchers. Fire behaved selectively, as though responding to intention. When the sheriff tried to piece together what had led to this, he visited nearby ranches searching for witnesses. Most refused to speak. One old man said he had seen the guide walking across the plain 3 days before the fire, carrying a lantern that emitted no light. A child claimed she had seen a figure standing in the flames, taller than any man, shining from inside. Her mother forbade her from repeating it. The desert, of course, holds heat long after sunset. It also holds memory. Even now, more than a century later, that patch of earth remains strangely barren. Travelers say their compasses spin there and animals avoid it. The locals, when they pass by, lower their voices. Historians who study the case believe the tragedy unfolded as a result of group psychosis, a closed community spiraling inward until reality collapsed under belief. The fasting, the isolation, the heat, and the persuasive power of a single man created a perfect storm of suggestion. When he spoke of fire as a bridge, they believed him. And when he told them to walk through it, they did. But there are details that refuse to fit neatly into that explanation. The uneven burn patterns, the absence of smoke, the preservation of certain objects. It is as if the fire itself obeyed a logic beyond chemistry. Some scientists have proposed that the oil they used produced a low oxygen burn, starving the flames and consuming flesh without full combustion. Others argue that the conditions of the desert, its minerals, its dryness, its charged atmosphere, might have altered the way the fire behaved. None of these theories explain the absence of the guide. In his absence, the story of what happened has taken on the quality of myth. For decades afterward, travelers told stories of a lone preacher wandering the desert, his robes scorched black, his voice rasping like wind through a pipe. Some claimed he approached their camps at night, asking for matches. Others said he offered none, only a warning. The dawn comes for all. Whether those stories were true or not hardly matters now. What matters is that, for the people of Arizona at the time, this event marked a turning point. A realization that faith could burn as brightly as madness. The newspapers called it fanaticism. The survivors of nearby towns called it contagion. Some families packed their belongings and left the territory entirely, afraid that the land itself had been cursed. Years later, when settlers built a new road across the plain, they avoided the area where the chapel once stood. The engineers said the ground was too soft, that it sank when the machines passed over. A few construction workers reported strange burns appearing on their hands after touching the soil. The project was rerouted 3 miles east. To this day, no one has built there again. At sunset, the place still glows faintly when the light hits right, an illusion perhaps, or something more. Those who have visited say they felt the air tighten, like the moment before a storm. They described the faintest hint of warmth underfoot, as though the fire never fully died. And when the wind passes through the hollow where the chapel once stood, it sometimes sounds like singing, soft, rhythmic, and desperate. When the news first reached town, no one believed it. The story was too extreme, too unnatural to fit the world they knew. The telegraph operator in Phoenix refused to send the first report, thinking it a cruel hoax. But by the next morning, riders from nearby homesteads arrived, faces gray with dust and fear. They spoke of a fire that made no smoke, of bodies that did not fall. Then the lawmen rode out, and the silence that followed their return told everyone enough. The first newspaper to print the story was the Arizona Republican. Under the headline, "Desert Sect Found Burned in Ritual Blaze," the article was brief, clinical, stripped of emotion. It described a small community of religious extremists who had apparently immolated themselves as part of a ceremony. But even the reporters could not ignore what they saw. The heat was contained, one wrote. Surrounding scrub and sand showed no sign of charring. The fire was obedient. Soon the larger papers picked it up. The San Francisco Chronicle ran the headline, "The Fire That Killed Without Smoke." New York called them lunatics of the wasteland. Across the country, readers debated whether the event was proof of mass hysteria or something darker, a hint that the frontier still hid forces untouched by reason. The sheriff's investigation moved slowly. Arizona was still a territory, sparsely governed, and the nearest coroner had to travel 3 days by rail. By the time officials arrived, what little evidence remained had been swept away by wind. The bones were brittle, the papers half-ash. Even so, the county records show that samples of soil and residue were sent to laboratories in Chicago and Denver. The results came back inconclusive. The oil they burned contained no known accelerant. It was neither lamp fuel nor alcohol. "It behaves as though alive," one chemist wrote in his notes. Local pastors held sermons to calm their congregations, urging them not to mistake madness for revelation. "These were not saints," one minister said. "They were lost sheep who mistook smoke for light." Yet outside, when the sermons ended, people still whispered that perhaps the brethren had seen something others could not. The idea that someone might choose to walk into fire unsettled them more than the flames themselves. Doctors, too, tried to find explanations. The term autosuggestion had recently entered popular psychology, describing how belief could alter perception and pain. Some physicians argued the cult's leader had used fasting, exhaustion, and repetition to push his followers into trance-like obedience. One paper quoted a doctor saying, "The mind can make the body forget it is dying." Another suggested they may have consumed ergot, a fungus that induces hallucinations, but no trace of it was ever found in the soil or the victims' remains. Meanwhile, the surviving townspeople, those who lived within a few miles of the compound, struggled with their own unease. Children had nightmares of glowing men walking through the desert. Livestock refused to graze near the site. Women covered their mirrors at night, fearing the reflection might show what the fire had taken. A few men offered to burn the remains entirely to free the land. The sheriff forbade it, saying the dead deserved rest, not erasure. Weeks passed before the ashes cooled enough to be buried. There was no ceremony. A single trench was dug, and the remains, what could be gathered, were laid together. The site was marked only by a wooden post with the date carved into it. No names, no verses. In the months that followed, letters arrived from across the country. Some came from spiritualists who believed the brethren had succeeded in transcending flesh. Others came from scientists requesting soil samples, photographs, or even bones for study. The sheriff refused every request. He ordered the site sealed, the evidence locked in a small storeroom behind the courthouse. But pieces slipped away, photographs copied, fragments stolen by travelers who wanted a relic of what they called the fire of faith. By spring, the territory's governor announced a formal inquiry, not out of compassion but concern. Rumors had begun to spread that new groups were forming, inspired by the Brethren's ascension. In one report, settlers near Yuma described a preacher who carried a scorched Bible and promised his congregation a painless dawn. He disappeared before authorities could question him. The incident forced Arizona's leaders to confront something they had long ignored: the loneliness of the desert, the way isolation could twist devotion into something unrecognizable. The open land had offered freedom, but it also offered silence, and in that silence, faith could echo until it became unbearable. Social commentators of the time wrote long essays about the dangers of unchecked mysticism. They saw the event as a symptom of America's shifting identity. The frontier was closing, cities were rising, science was replacing old belief, and many people felt left behind. In that uncertainty, small communities turned inward, seeking meaning wherever it would answer. Sometimes it answered in whispers, sometimes in flame. For years after, travelers continued to visit the place, some out of curiosity, others out of reverence. They left small offerings, stones, coins, flowers that withered in the heat. A few claimed they heard faint singing in the air. Others reported a sensation of warmth along their skin, as though sunlight had passed directly through them. The church authorities eventually declared the site an unholy ground and forbade worship there. But spiritualists and occult researchers kept returning. In 1911, an amateur photographer named Thomas Laird took several long exposure shots of the area at dusk. When developed, one plate showed faint silhouettes near the horizon, figures seated in a row, facing east. The exposure had lasted nearly 10 minutes. No human could have remained still that long in the open wind. Laird swore he had seen nothing while taking the photo. That image circulated quietly among paranormal circles for decades, earning the site its later name, the Dawnfield. Even now, historians debate its authenticity. For the people of Arizona, however, the cult's fire became less a mystery than a caution. Parents told their children never to follow preachers who promised heaven too soon. Teachers used the story to warn against isolation. But older folks, those who had smelled the strange sweetness of that night, never spoke of it at all. They had seen something that words could not contain, and perhaps that silence was their truest reaction. Because how do you explain devotion so absolute it consumes itself? How do you bury belief when it has already turned to ash? Over the years, the land reclaimed what remained. The winds scattered the markers. The trench filled with sand. When researchers returned in the 1930s, they found no trace of graves, only faint discolorations in the soil. Yet, when they tested the ground, the same anomaly persisted. Unusually high levels of magnetite, enough to disrupt compass needles. Some speculated lightning strikes had altered the minerals. Others thought the heat of the fire had fused them. But there was no evidence of a storm that night. The few artifacts preserved, the charred mirror, the sketches, the bowls, were sent to a museum in Tucson. They remain unlisted in public catalogs, stored under the heading Unclassified Religious Objects. Curators who have handled them report a faint oily residue that resists cleaning. One wrote privately, "They smell like rain that never comes." Every generation seems to rediscover the story, reshaping it for their time. In the 1950s, writers called it an early American tragedy of faith. In the 1970s, occult enthusiasts claimed it as proof of energy transmutation. Modern skeptics see it as an extreme case of psychological control. Each interpretation says more about the living than the dead. But in the quiet deserts of Arizona, the people closest to that place still treat it differently. They do not visit after dark. They do not camp nearby. And when the wind shifts and carries a faint, dry heat through the night, they whisper the same warning their grandparents did. The fire remembers. The night the fire began was not marked by thunder or wind. It was still almost unnaturally so. The desert air held no sound, no movement. Even the coyotes that usually cried across the plains had gone silent. Later, a rancher miles away would say he woke suddenly, not from a noise, but from the feeling that the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the chapel, the brethren gathered in silence. Their leader stood at the front, a figure thin and motionless, his white robe pale in the lamplight. Around him, men and women knelt, their faces hollow from fasting, their hands clasped but trembling. They had prepared for this night for months. The journals recovered later describe a ritual of purification. They believed that flesh was the last barrier between themselves and the divine, a veil of imperfection that needed to be burned away. But unlike other sects that sought symbolic cleansing, these people meant it literally. Each member carried a small bowl of oil, not the kind used for lamps, but something thicker, almost amber in color, drawn from the desert's shale pits. They had refined it themselves in iron drums, convinced that its smoke would open the sky. At precisely midnight, the leader raised his hand. The gesture was small, almost hesitant, but it was enough. A hymn began, soft, tuneless, more like a murmur than a melody. No instruments, no rhythm, just human voices, low and wavering, filling the room with something that did not sound like prayer, but surrender. The first to move was a woman. She rose, her bowl trembling in her hands. She poured the oil over her shoulders and hair, then knelt again, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. A man followed, then another. One by one, they anointed themselves, the floor darkening beneath them as the oil spread. There were children there too, not many, but enough that later reports could not ignore it. The leader had insisted they would not suffer. "Fire purifies the innocent first," he had said. "They will not feel what we do." When the hymn ended, there was a long pause. The air hung thick with the scent of oil and dust. A few members began to shake, their lips moving in silent repetition of the same phrase. "The door will open. The door will open." Outside, a single lantern burned near the entrance. One of the younger men had been ordered to wait there, not as a witness, but as the final participant. His role was to close the door after the last of them entered the light. He stood barefoot in the sand, his face turned toward the horizon. He did not look back when he heard the match strike. Inside, the flame caught quickly. For a moment, it was only a flicker, a trembling spark that barely reached the walls. Then the oil began to burn. It spread in thin lines along the floorboards, curling around the pews, tracing the edges of the altar. No one screamed. Not yet. The leader remained still as the fire climbed. He raised his arms as if in welcome. His voice carried through the crackle. "Do not run. We are not leaving. We are ascending." The first sound of pain came minutes later, faint but sharp, a gasp cut short. Then another, and another. The hymn did not return. What replaced it was a strange rhythmic moan, a collective breath rising and falling, as though the room itself were breathing. By the time the outer door glowed red, the young man outside had fallen to his knees. The light behind him pulsed like a living thing, pressing against the seams of the wooden walls. He whispered something no one could later understand, then crawled backward toward the sand. Witnesses from the nearest homestead said they saw the glow just after 1 in the morning. It rose like dawn from the ground itself, a soft orange halo that lit the entire horizon. One woman claimed she thought the sun had come early. Her husband saddled his horse to investigate, but halfway there, the light simply vanished. When he reached the site, there was nothing left burning, only heat hanging in the air, and the smell of something sweet and metallic. The chapel's remains were found the next day. The fire had burned from the inside out, leaving the outer structure almost untouched. The wooden beams stood blackened but upright, as though protecting the emptiness within. No embers, no smoke, only the floor, a smooth, glassy surface where the boards had melted together. The sheriff who entered first wrote in his report, "It felt like standing inside a lung that had forgotten how to breathe." They found the bodies arranged in a circle, each facing inward. The positions were too neat, too deliberate for chaos. The leader sat at the center, his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed. What remained of his face had fused into something unrecognizable, part bone, part soot. A single lantern sat beside him, still upright, the glass blackened but unbroken. Its wick had burned clean. The young man who waited outside was found several yards away, collapsed in the sand. He was still alive when they reached him, though barely conscious. His skin was cold, not burned, but pale as wax. He repeated the same phrase until he died hours later. They were light inside. No one could explain the lack of smoke. The nearest trees showed no scorch marks. Even the grass a few feet from the chapel was untouched. The only evidence of fire was confined entirely to the people themselves. A few of the investigators believed the cult had used phosphorus or magnesium, substances known to ignite rapidly. But tests found none. Others suggested spontaneous combustion, but that theory was dismissed. Bodies do not ignite themselves, one doctor insisted. When the medical examiner began his work, he found something stranger still. In every body, the lungs were completely empty. No ash, no air, just emptiness, as if each person had exhaled their last breath all at once, and never drawn another. That discovery never reached the newspapers. The sheriff ordered the file sealed. Years later, when historians tried to piece together what happened, they relied on a handful of surviving letters written by nearby settlers. One woman described hearing what she thought was thunder just before the fire ended, a deep, echoing sound that came from beneath the ground. Another claimed she saw a column of light reaching into the sky, though no one else confirmed it. For the survivors who lived near the site, the memory of that night never left. They spoke of strange after effects, compasses spinning, lamps refusing to stay lit, livestock dying without visible cause. But the strangest thing was the temperature. For weeks after, the ground around the chapel stayed warm to the touch, even at night. When scientists returned years later, they found traces of fused silica and iron in the soil, the same composition found in lightning strikes. But the pattern of the burn suggested something more focused, more deliberate. A heat that came from nowhere visible, then vanished completely. The tragedy became one of the most disturbing unsolved events in Arizona's early history. It was cited in scientific journals, whispered about by priests, and used by skeptics as proof of how far faith could twist reason. But for those who had seen it with their own eyes, there was nothing to prove. The fire had burned itself into their memories, quiet, colorless, absolute. By dawn, nothing moved in the desert. The light returned to its ordinary hue. The sky was blank, wide, and mercilessly calm. And beneath it, 24 people had disappeared into the one thing they believed would set them free. The sheriff stood there until the sun rose high enough to wash the red from the sand. He wrote one final line in his notebook before leaving the site. They did not die screaming. They died listening. Years passed, and the desert reclaimed the ground where the chapel once stood. The wind scattered the ashes, sand filled the shallow foundation, and by 1910, the site appeared as nothing more than a pale circle of earth under the relentless sun. But the story of the fire, the night 24 souls vanished into silence, never fully faded. It survived in whispers, in half-remembered newspaper clippings, and in the private diaries of those who saw the light. When the first formal investigation concluded, its findings were brief. The document described the incident as a collective act of religious self-immolation, citing exhaustion, isolation, and psychological manipulation. The tone was clinical, almost detached. It was easier to write about madness than to face the possibility that something unexplained had occurred. But others could not let it go. In 1906, a physician from Tucson named Dr. Leland Moore visited the site, determined to find physical evidence that could explain what had happened. He brought instruments to test for chemical residues, samples of the soil, even fragments of the fused wood. His report, now stored in the archives of the Arizona Historical Society, contains one disturbing note. The soil radiates warmth at intervals, though no visible source exists. It is as if the ground breathes. He also found that the small iron cross placed by a later visitor had partially melted on one side, though the ambient temperature that day was below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Moore left Arizona shortly after, claiming the desert refused answers. In time, people began to reinterpret the story. Preachers in nearby towns turned it into a sermon about the dangers of false prophets. They followed a man instead of God, one pastor warned his flock. And in doing so, they mistook fire for light. Scientists saw it as a case study in mass psychosis, a collision of isolation, hunger, and faith. To psychologists, it became a textbook example of group delusion, later referenced in studies on cult behavior. Yet none of these explanations could fully account for the physical evidence, the lack of smoke, the clean combustion, the pattern of heat that stopped precisely at the chapel's walls. The more people tried to explain it, the more the story slipped from reason's grasp. By the 1930s, the incident had become part of Arizona's folklore. Locals spoke of the fire that waits beneath the sand. Travelers who camped near the site sometimes reported seeing faint lights at night, small, hovering orbs that moved against the wind. Skeptics dismissed them as phosphorescent insects or reflections from mining lamps far away. But those who had grown up near the area swore otherwise. They said the lights were listening, moving closer if one spoke too loudly. A few spiritualists claimed the brethren had not died at all, but crossed into some higher vibration, leaving behind only the shell of their bodies. In the 1960s, a fringe group calling itself the New Dawn Assembly tried to recreate the ritual, setting up tents a few miles from the original site. Authorities intervened before anything happened. The leader was arrested and later declared unfit to stand trial. When questioned, he said only, "They called me in a dream. They said the light was gentle." Today, the exact location of the original chapel is uncertain. The desert has shifted and the old landmarks have vanished. A few explorers claim to have found remnants, charred stones, warped metal, pieces of pottery fused with sand. One researcher brought a magnet to the site and found it behaved erratically, spinning toward the ground instead of north. He left quickly and never returned. The story endures because it sits at the uneasy border between science and faith, a place where the rational and the sacred collide. For some, it is proof that human devotion can destroy itself when left unanchored. For others, it is evidence that belief might open doors the rest of us cannot see. What makes it linger, perhaps, is not the fire itself, but the silence that followed it. The way the event seemed to erase itself, leaving behind almost nothing. No smoke, no ruins, no explanation that fully satisfies. Only a strange warmth in the ground and a story that refuses to die. Historians often say that early 20th century Arizona was a land divided between settlers and solitude, between faith and survival. Isolation did not just test the body, it tested the mind. In that emptiness, men built gods out of dust, and sometimes they tried to join them. A letter written by one of the investigating deputies, never published, captures something the official reports could not. He wrote to his wife, "I think they wanted to be seen, not by us, but by whatever waits in that silence. I watched the light fade, and for a moment I thought it saw me too." Over a century later, archaeologists occasionally revisit the region, searching for evidence of the cult's existence. Some find nothing, others return shaken, claiming the desert hums faintly at night, a sound just at the edge of hearing, a vibration that comes and goes with the wind. Whether it is the echo of the fire, the shifting of metal beneath the sand, or something that never fully left, no one can say. But in every version of the story, one detail remains the same: the quiet. No screams, no chaos, only the measured rhythm of a hymn sung once and never again. And so the story of the cult that burned themselves alive has become something larger than tragedy, a mirror held to the part of human faith that cannot bear silence, a reminder that the line between devotion and destruction is drawn not in flame, but in belief itself. The fire took their bodies, but what they thought they saw in that final moment, that remains untold. Maybe it was only heat and hallucination, or maybe, just for an instant, they saw what they had been reaching for all along, a door made of light. Waiting in the dark, Whatever it was, it has never gone cold. Even now, travelers crossing that stretch of Arizona sometimes pause when the wind shifts, feeling the air grow strangely warm. They turn toward the horizon, half expecting to see a faint glow. There is never anything there, but the warmth lingers a moment longer than it should, and that perhaps is how such stories survive. Not in the ashes, but in the air.